Welcome to the Conversations That Matter podcast. My name is John Harris, and I am joined today by Scott Willis, who is or was a crew intern for 2 years at the University of Florida. And he is going to share his story of what he saw from the ground up inside crew. And so, Scotty, you have worked for crew, or at least you interned with them for 2 years. And I just want to bring our audience up to speed real quick with what's going on at Crew, and then I'm going to give you the floor. So a few weeks ago, a video came out, a montage of some of the speakers and what they were saying at Crew 19, which was a staff conference for Crew. And since then, some other things have been dug up, not just by myself, but by others who have shown that Crew is sliding as an organization into not just social justice, but that whole panoply, like going soft on homosexuality and just a bunch of stuff came up. And so I've done, I think, 3 videos now where I've talked about some of this, and there's been a reaction within Crew. And so I think the most notable thing is Sellers, who is the vice president of Crew, put out a letter to their donors. And I guess it went out to staff as well. But it was to their supporters, though, is my understanding. And he tried to sort of combat some of the things that have been said about Crew. But all that's really been said is what Crew's saying. It's just, here's the video. You can watch it for yourself. Here's clips of people on staff at Crew saying things. And so, Scott, I'm very curious to hear your perspective on this. And I'm sure everyone watching this is, as someone who was involved with Crew. What is going on in Crew? Tell us a little bit about your experience there. Is it sliding towards social justice? And if so, on what level?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I was an intern for just 2 years, and I was involved as a student. That does mean that my experience is somewhat limited. But I think that my experience plus everything that you've said, everything that I've heard others complain about, both current and former staff members, I think my experience fits in with that. So what I'm hoping to do is to share my little slice of the pie and sort of show how it corroborates. I think there definitely seems to be a move towards social justice. And I think there are 2 sorts of people that I've found, or that I personally experienced. In my time with Crew, either ones who were very much into the ideas of oppression and oppressed, intersectionality, etc., or you had people who simply followed along, or of course you also had people who didn't agree, or who mostly ignored it. But there's definitely a movement that I experienced toward imbibing that cultural narrative of this certain sector of our society is a victim, this certain group is a victim, ethnic group, or gender in the case of women, that there was some of that too. There's definitely, in my experience, seems to be a lurch toward that. But it's not just Crew. I mean, other people have pointed out it's the PCA, it's the SBC, it's Gospel Coalition, a lot of different organizations. So
yeah, that's a good point. I wanted to ask, and I do want to hear your story. I want to hear some of the things that you saw and the evidence for why you're saying that it is taking that turn. But I want to ask you this. I've had a number of Crew staff members reach out to me on social media, email, and the theme that I keep hearing is, don't tell anyone who I am. I can't talk publicly. You're the only person that I've talked to who's a former Crew staff who's been, and technically, I know you said you weren't on staff, you were an intern, but
I mean, it's very, very similar. It's just a limited 2-year position, but
okay.
You do a lot of the same things a staff person does during that 2 years.
So you're the only person that was a staff member or an intern who's been willing to actually come on camera publicly and talk about these things. Why is that? How come staff members are afraid to talk about what's going on inside Crew?
Well, I think some people, I had mentioned there are 2 groups, either those that are really, really promoting it or who just go along with the flow. I think a lot of people aren't aware that there's any disagreement, especially among the interns or younger staff. I think certainly in my experience, there are some that simply this is what they've heard and they accept it because it's coming from trusted authorities. That's the impression I've gotten. Also, I mean, it's really hard to talk against your boss. And
Right. And I get that.
yeah, definitely the backlash from friends or coworkers. I mean, I felt that to a limited degree because I'm really not all that important as a person, but I definitely experienced that. I mean, I posted several times on my Facebook pointing out like there are alternative viewpoints. Crew seems to be going in this direction. Not just Crew, but again, that litany of other organizations. And I got dogpiled every time I did. So there's a lot of mentality where basically follow in line, don't go against the team. I think that leads to people not wanting to speak out. People don't want to jeopardize their jobs and their livelihood or the ministries that they've worked really hard to build up. I mean, I think of staff people that I know who definitely don't agree with this, but don't want to jeopardize what they're doing because what they're doing is good and they can more or less do it independently. There are people who are able to get around the social justice stuff. Just because it's promoted from the top doesn't mean that everyone is promoting it themselves. That you can still get sectors of Crew and of course there's other organizations where you just don't hear it. Yeah. I think a lot of people are also concerned, or this is what I heard from the people that I know, could be different for other people, but they're concerned that if Crew has too much negative publicity, that it would hurt either their supporters or their parent supporters or their friends' supporters, and that they would lose funds. I've heard that. I don't really find that a convincing reason not to speak out. I think the New Testament paradigm is that those who are promoting false doctrine are the ones who are divisive, not those who point out the false doctrine.
That's right.
And thus, if there are financial repercussions, which is unfortunate for people who aren't going the wrong way. I mean, there can be collateral damage sometimes, and that I would want to minimize that and encourage people not just to pull out their funds. Talk to your ministry partners first, definitely. But at some point, if there are repercussions for people, that's big Crew's fault. That's the people who are actually promoting these ideas. But I think those are some ideas or reasons that would lead people not to want to speak out.
So what did you see then when you were interning with Crew for those 2 years on the local, national, state level? All three of those things. What did you notice that prompted you to think, wow, this organization as a whole seems to be moving this way?
Well, I'll get to the local team last. And when I do, I don't intend to share personal names just because I don't think it's right to pick on private individuals.
Understandable.
But definitely at both of the winter conferences I went to in the Southeast, and the way they describe the regions has shifted over the past few years because they just did a massive reorganization. But that played a significant role. Just this past December, we had a PCA pastor get up and he preached from Nehemiah, the section of Nehemiah that's on the covenant renewal ceremony. And he talked about white privilege and talked about how people that complain that this is just a political thing, they're just irritating him. And then I think went to twist the passage by reading himself in modern sociological ideas into the passage. That's another reason why it really irritates me, because it's not faithful exegesis of the biblical text. It's really reading modern ideas in. The winter conference before that, toward the end, there was a giant panel, not giant. We had the giant stage with a large audience, and there were several people on the stage in this panel. Two young Black women, an Asian woman, and a Hispanic woman, and a white guy. And you can guess which one was doing I just need to listen. I just need to hear what they're saying. I'm the one who's has the power, and I want to give that up. That was very, very clear. And I thought it was very unfortunate, both for those young women because they don't have to be victims. I think really the mentality is subversive to human dignity on both sides, but that happened. And those weren't the only things at Winter Conference. There are positive things. There are wonderful speakers at both of them, but this is something that's coming in. It's not the only thing that's going on with Cru. There's a lot of good, which is why I'd say I really want to push back, because this isn't Cru's legacy, and I don't want it to be.
Right.
There's great work that.
Yeah, and we don't want that either.
Does.
Yeah, I don't want that. This is more of a warning to say, don't go this direction, because we love you and you've done some good things, not let's destroy the organization. And I think maybe that's being misunderstood by some of those in leadership there. I've seen some of the posts by.
Well, it's damage control. And I had that experience on a really small level.
Scott, you just mentioned 2 winter conferences, and what years? Do you remember what years those were that you're talking about?
The last December and then the December before that.
Oh, okay, so recent.
The videos are online if you want to go find all the speakers.
Okay, and the other panel was what subject was that panel supposed to be talking about that they got into this weird conversation?
The entire theme of the winter conference was supposed to be on world missions. This was in Atlanta the year before last, and they talked to, they're really, I think the ideas of ethnic minorities and missions have gotten really wrapped up in and almost indistinguishable in the minds of some people with the social justice, victimhood, oppressor, oppressed sort of mentality. So they were talking about ways in which majority culture can listen to minority culture. That was the general thrust of it.
Gotcha.
There were other weird things that happened there too.
So yeah, tell us a little more. Tell us what other things you saw. I know you wanted to leave the local stuff sort of to the end, but what other things did you see at some of these conferences?
Well, just at the winter conference in Atlanta year before last, it was really weird. Normally, I think what they do, and this had been my first winter conference, but my understanding is that normally they have an outreach day, which is great. Train young Christian college students in evangelism. And someone majorly goofed because they ended up inviting this guy who was a lunatic, for lack of a better word. And they fixed it. They fixed it very quickly. Someone did not do their homework, and they sent out a massive apology and shut him down very quickly. Basically, the complaint was, if you want to look up the guy, Whirlwind Missions, I think is the organization. No one at Cru actually takes him seriously. It was a complete mistake, and they handled it well. They cut it off, but the point that everyone was offended by was that he'd made racially insensitive comments, which was horrible. If you can think of, just imagine a stereotypical kind of bore, like a obnoxious person who really is uncultured and puts his foot in his mouth. That's pretty much what this guy was. But he was also a raging Pelagian. And what he wanted us to do was to go to this poor apartment complex and talk to these kids and try and get them to pray the sinner's prayer. And boom, they pray this prayer and they become Christians. And yay, good. No emphasis on the local church, getting them discipled, getting their families discipled. It was about as theologically bad as you can think. And after he left, everyone was offended, and rightly so. And Cru sent out a massive apology to everyone via email, even people who weren't there, and convened a assembly for all the staff and people who were at not the students, they wanted to keep them out, thank goodness, but the staff, and to give them an opportunity to voice their complaints and the ways in which they're offended. As I recall, I was the only one who was offended by the obnoxious Pelagianism. Let's just get these kids to pray a prayer and that means they're Christians. Everyone else was offended by the obnoxious statements that he made about culture and ethnicity, which were bad, but
what direction were they flowing in? I'm just a little confused. So he's making these statements against a particular ethnic group then?
It wasn't against, he was just, woefully
Stereotyping.
stereotyping, particularly Hispanics,
Okay.
it wasn't good. It was bad, but there's also the completely aberrant theology that no one else seemed to notice.
Okay. So your point is that there's kind of a weak theology then.
They cared much more about him putting his foot in his mouth and being offensive in terms of ethnicity than they did about him wanting to get false converts, effectively.
Okay. Yeah, that's
Theological
interesting.
priorities were not in the right order.
Yeah, and that's something that I've noticed in other organizations as well. It seems like there's more of a priority, more of an orthodoxy almost that's forming around these more tertiary or secondary issues. And of course, we don't want to offend anyone when it's not necessary, if possible, obviously. And there's certainly racially insensitive remarks that we would both condemn here together, but we would see those things as bad, but not as bad as someone going to hell because they've trusted
Exactly.
in false gospel. And
Exactly.
we're seeing the cart before the horse now, which is interesting. So what other things did you see then at some of these conferences? I know you had talked on the phone and you told me a few things.
Those were the primary things that I encountered at the winter conferences. There was also the new staff intern training. We basically last October we had to go away for a week to, I forget where, is somewhere in South Carolina, toward the northern tip, and Spartanburg, I think. Yeah, Spartanburg. And again, the emphasis was very much on, let's listen to these minority groups. Let's set aside our privilege. They showed a movie on MLK and the civil rights movement, which is great. I mean, that's a wonderful thing, but it doesn't have much to do with missions and evangelism on a college campus. That's if your hope is suffrage for a particular ethnic group, that's a really worldly hope. And again, it was the priorities. Yeah. Misusing Ephesians 2. That's an interesting one. I heard that at several different points, where that's just sort of simplistically used for racial reconciliation. It has application very much, but I think what people forget is that it's talking about Jews and Gentiles coming together, and Gentiles and Jews forming the new Israel, the new covenant community. And when you just cut corners exegetically and apply it to African Americans and white people in America, you miss the wonderful unity of all these ethnic groups coming together to form, in effect, a new Israel, a new nation that isn't at home here on earth, but in the new heavens. And I think with these wrong emphases, with the issues of priority that I experienced, again, I have my narrow experience, but I think others corroborate this. They end up missing out. That was one of the passages I heard talked about at that training week. And there are other weird things.
Was that the training week? I know you had mentioned to me when we spoke that you had to go and do, it was kind of like an evangelism, but not really. Yeah. Okay, well, why don't you tell that story?
Really the guy, we were each, because we were all new staff and interns, and there were older staff with us who were supposed to like mentor us and guide us. The guy, he was a wonderful guy. I enjoyed spending time with him those days. But he had me and another intern break off, and we went to this sort of satellite campus. I forget what college it is. It's in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And we had normal versions of the KGP, the Knowing God Personally booklet, the Four Spiritual Laws, for those who aren't familiar. And we had specific ones for Impact, which is the African American Outreach Ministry of Crew. And what he wanted me and this other intern to do is to go find all the African American students and invite them to an Impact meeting that we're trying to start on campus. It was just socially awkward because I and the other guy are these two young white dudes, and walking up to the black students like, come join our black student ministry. And it was just really weird. And I tried to explain, this is socially awkward. I don't think it's going to work.
Yeah, well, it's not the church either. The church is supposed to welcome, every background to, like you just said, unite around the common message of the gospel and forgiveness in Christ. That's just, that would be awkward to say, I'm not in your group, but come out for a group for you. Yeah.
I mean, and I don't mind outreaches that are specifically targeting groups. I mean, we have Muslim outreaches. We have outreaches that are missionaries that specifically go to try and win Jews or people of Asian American background. I don't mind that as long as they're brought into the church. But it was just really weird. So eventually I looked at my friend and said, we're not going to do this anymore. We took the normal booklets, the tracts, and we started walking up to people, inviting them to the normal meeting and saying, hey, we have this other thing that you can go to if you'd like.
Well, it seems like the assumption behind something like that, and this isn't the first time I've heard of a similar, I've heard of even, guys trying to use theobonics, which is like eubonics, but hey, white dudes who grew up in the suburbs, you need to start learning theobonics. And it almost is like that they assume that there's a barrier that ethnic groups have that makes it impossible for them to understand the Christian message apart from changing the whole style and the way it's communicated, which is unlike, a religious background like a Muslim. A Muslim, of course, is going to come from a background that they understand Islam, and you have to talk about what the Trinity is and explain it. And those there's an actual barrier there, but it's almost like they're creating an artificial barrier because, if I talk to someone who knows English, who's grown up in this country, like I shouldn't have to go to them and be like, well, I know you're 50% black or you're Asian or they speak my language. I can tell them the gospel, right? That's my heart and my sense.
I think, I definitely think there's a danger to pushing the contextualization too far. Later on in that day, I had a conversation with the guy because I very clearly did not agree with the sort of mentality and approach to witnessing and evangelizing particular groups that he had. And we were talking about the local church and how this would work. And I forget the details of the conversation, but it became very clear to me after a while that the issue really was one of ecclesiology and his understanding of the mission of the church. His concern was that certain aspects of the church and worship they would turn off certain minorities, that they wouldn't be able to overcome this, and that they wouldn't feel at home, they'd feel uncomfortable, and they would leave. And I'm part of the OPC, Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We hold to the regulative principle of worship, the idea that our standards of worship aren't whatever the Bible permits, but rather what the Bible prescribes. And if those are your priorities, then as long as you have the right preaching of the word and the sacraments, all the other stuff, that it doesn't matter as much. And his argument in response was, well, it might take a lifetime for these people to get to that point where they understand that. And I think that goes back to what you were saying, where you assume that these groups can't understand.
So wait, let me get this straight. He was saying like a certain ethnic group, it would take them a lifetime to understand. I want to just make sure.
Because of their cultural background and the perceived hurts they might feel, the perceived depression that they might feel, the hostility that they might be worried about, or just general uncomfortableness.
So he's saying that's a barrier to the gospel then?
That, certain styles of worship might be.
Wow, that's fascinating. Do you remember what styles, or was it vague?
I can't remember. It was vague. I think most of the time we were trying to understand what on earth the other person was saying.
It's a new language.
You chase your opponent around trying to define the terms. But it did become clear that a lot of this was the result of not having, I think, a fully formed theology.
That's
nature
fascinating.
holds a vacuum. If you don't have good, solid theology that's comprehensive, I think you end up imbibing stuff with the world. That's certainly what's happening with the issue of homosexuality and
Sure.
crew everywhere. It's certainly not just crew. I encountered it in RUF as a student, encountered it elsewhere.
So, why don't we talk a little bit more about, I don't know if you have other stories you wanted to share from more the national level, but if not, let's talk about some of the things you experienced on the local level, because these
Sure.
were, to me, more
Mhm.
concerning, because you shared concerns about some of the things you saw and the response you got. I just think that it's almost terrifying that you would get the
Yeah.
response that you got. So why don't you go ahead and talk about some of that?
Again, I do want to stress that I love the people that I worked with. We didn't always get along, and I think there was not the smoothest ending. But I do care about them, and my goal isn't to hurt them. That's why I'm not going to share their names.
I
But
respect that.
I think there were some things that were very upsetting, and I think they weren't handled very well. We had not last fall before. Last fall we talked about same-sex attraction every other week, and that was explosive.
Every
And
other week.
we had staff meetings
Wow.
on Mondays, and yeah, I think there are more important things to talk about, but what the sort of things I was interested in weren't priorities, unfortunately. But that wasn't my decision. So one of the other girls was really felt led to minister to that group because we were on a college campus, a secular school, so not a big portion, but a sizable one. And she felt called to that, which is fine. I don't think the resources that we used were the best. I think crew is kind of soft, but they're not the only ones. But the year before that, every staff meeting, we'd start off with a discussion about a particular minority group. Or in the case of women, a perceived minority group, because they're not actually a minority, an oppressed group. We talked about Asian Americans. We talked about, I don't know if we ever got to Native Americans. We got to African Americans, definitely, women. We were going to get to LGBTQ plus people. I was going to lead that. That would have been interesting. But that got cut off. We talked about Hispanics, etc. Never talked about men. But yeah, those were really uncomfortable conversations, and I think my leaders sincerely wanted to have good conversations, but I know the people who were the guy who was in charge at the time, and he really is good at listening and does care. But I think it might have been slightly naive to think that it would work, just because you can't have such an explosive conversation, potentially explosive conversation in the span of 15 minutes.
So Scott, what I'm hearing from you is, 2 years, you're on staff. Essentially, you're an intern, and you're in these staff meetings. And for the first year, one of the themes that kept coming up was these oppressed groups.
Yeah.
So trying to understand them, which trying to understand is one thing, but you're saying this was the whole thing. It was like that was the main emphasis, was just trying to understand victim groups. And then the second year, same-sex attraction and understanding that was the emphasis.
Yeah, and I'll get to that in a moment. It wasn't just understanding. There really wasn't time to think critically and to really talk about it. What I felt very much, the way I felt pressured, was to listen and agree. Particularly the staff person who was leading it. Not the one who was overall over everything, but the individual who was leading it very much was in favor of listen, and that really meant agree.
So to agree that these groups are oppressed, that we as the Christians need to do something,
and that I would have a voice. I can't think critically about it
because you're not an oppressed individual.
Because I'm white and male.
Okay.
And this was part of the thing that really caught my attention with that sort of litany of clips that was put together and sent around the web. The one I don't know if you saw the same video or if there are multiple versions of it, but the clip at the end of the video I saw with the woman at Q&A asking the speakers, well, my family came over and after slavery. And that's documented. We never had slaves. How can I be blamed for this? And the response was, your skin color, because you're part of that culture, you benefit from the oppression of others. And I asked that same question, and I had that exact same response given to me.
Mm-hmm. So these are the discussions.
Who didn't necessarily know my background, which was actually quite cosmopolitan growing up. Grew up in a secular family with a lot of different kind of friends. But that didn't matter.
So this is interesting because Steve Sellers, when he put out this message to all the supporters, he said, those people that we had at our staff conference this last summer, like Sandra Van Obstel and James White, and they were just guests. They don't necessarily represent crew's beliefs. But what you're telling me is that same stuff that you saw in that clip, that was in the small group staff meetings you saw on the campus you were at.
Yeah, I mean, it might not have been that way with the other local teams, but it really was with mine.
That's interesting.
It wasn't all that we did. And not every staff member agrees with it. Certainly not. But that was the priority of the leadership of my team at the time.
What kinds of things did you see? I know you had told me some things about different events you held locally and some things you saw that kind of bothered you.
Mm-hmm. Well, that first year was interesting because we had a hurricane. And then Richard Spencer, the white supremacist neo-Nazi guy, came to our campus and caused
another hurricane,
another storm.
Yeah.
And we wanted to do something to respond to that, which is fair. And we invited a speaker, but this dragged on for multiple weeks. I think at some point it became too political. One of the staff members who was speaking and leading one of these events was wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt on stage, which I think was really inappropriate. And that individual wore it to many other things, including staff meetings.
So they represented crew and were wearing this in the capacity of being a representative on stage. Wow.
And I would not have worn I wouldn't have worn a Trump t-shirt. I wouldn't have been allowed. There's no way. I can't imagine I wouldn't have gotten fussed at for that, given the things I was fussed at for. But yeah, this individual did. And the same individual later on was on stage and encouraged all the students at our main meeting to sign a petition restoring voting rights to felons, which, I mean, if that individual wants to do it, that's fine.
But this was at a crew event.
Yeah. Which I went up to my boss afterward and said, I think this is really inappropriate. And his response was, well, but she's getting the idea from one of our churches that partners with us, and nothing happened. The same individual, on Slack, because we had been having these conversations, and I'm thinking, well, I know there's an alternative viewpoint. How about I share in our the Slack app where businesses communicate. Mm-hmm. I shared a link to the statement on social justice, the one that MacArthur and Vodi Balcom and the James White that I like put together, along with the first of MacArthur's blog articles about social justice. And I said, I think this is relevant given the sort of conversations we've had. I'd encourage you all to read it if you're interested, think critically about it, and just consider it whether you end up agreeing with it or not. I mean, it could not have been more innocuous. And I've shown it to others, my friends, and talked about it with others. But apparently it wasn't innocuous enough, because when I was talking to another of the staff members who was over me, one of my bosses, that could be one of several people, so I'll let people back home can't necessarily figure it out immediately. I was meeting with him for lunch because he wanted to get to know me. And that came up, and he was like, I wanted to talk to you, Scotty, about appropriate use of Slack. And my heart went cold. I didn't know what he was talking about. I was ready to have something surprise me. And then it did surprise me because he mentioned that. And
so you're not allowed to share the statement on social justice.
No, I wasn't. Not in that context, apparently, because that's divisive and it would have caused arguments.
But you can wear a Black Lives Matter T-shirt.
Yeah, the better. Yeah, they were not handling it well. I think it gets better. I'll explain why I think that is, why they're not handling it well. But yeah, the conversation went on, and I asked him, well, how on earth should I have shared it? Because we had a large staff team. This was at the beginning of last year, August before last. And I thought it was relevant. How can I share this link with a bunch of people all at once so I don't have to go to them individually? And he kind of stared at me for a good 20 seconds because he didn't have a better answer. And finally he came up with one, well, I should have gone to everyone individually, which is just socially awkward. And it's inefficient and unnecessary. I mean, it was the specific after hours chat in our Slack app. It was the most efficient, most logical way to share it, but that wasn't okay. And he said, there's a spectrum of acceptable belief. There's the mainstream, and then there's acceptable dissent, and then there's stuff that's not acceptable over here, like white supremacy and KKK, etc. And I asked, well, are you suggesting that I'm in that latter category? And he said, well, some people would put you there, would put what that statement on social justice said there, which is really weird because MacArthur has partnered with Crew. That I think is very unfair. And I was an intern. Part of my weakness is I didn't necessarily speak up and approach them every time I should have. Mostly just kept it to myself. So I let it go. I mean, it's really hard to talk to your boss and say, I think you're wrong when you're
right.
But yeah, that I think wasn't handled well. And I think that among other things set a very negative tone for my year.
Yeah. What did that do for you, Scott, when you heard that? Was that kind of like you just put up your hands and said, well, forget it, I'm going to just kind of ride this out? Or like, how did it make you feel?
It got to that point. That was a process. And there are other things that don't have to do with social justice and this sort of trajectory that happen that aren't really relevant. They're more personal issues. But yeah, that was really unpleasant and hurtful. It definitely didn't endear me because like I was supposed to get to know him.
What's your sense, at least in the circle that you were in, of the other Crew staff members and interns? What are they thinking in general? I'm not looking for the outliers like yourself, but are they mostly, into the social justice stuff and waving that flag, or are they just kind of going along, or both? Or what do you think?
The impression I get, and again, my experience is limited, is that most people are just going along. I think there are a lot of faithful Christians who want to evangelize and are trying to do that well. And they hear trusted leaders promoting these ideas and they imbibe them. And that's part of why I'm willing to speak out, because I think of the students back home whom I really care about. And I don't want them to adopt these viewpoints just by default. They don't have to agree with me, but I want them to at least know that not everyone agrees with narratives, and that there are, I think, really convincing arguments against them.
Were there any other stories or situations that you wanted to share about from Crew at all?
Yeah, I mentioned that I think there's a reason why things were handled the way they were with me. I get the impression that with that one particular staff person who was very much into social justice movement and Black Lives Matter, et cetera, I think that individual caused a lot of noise and made people uncomfortable at times, and thus the people over me mainly wanted to keep the peace and were willing to make compromises that really weren't fair. One of my other coworkers had posted online on Facebook, the entire issue with Kavanaugh and the woman who was claiming he raped her, and remembered this after decades. He posted something to the effect of on Facebook, why would anyone believe this woman, with a link to an article. but that did not go over well, because the danger is that, well, if one of our female students sees this, what are they going to think? They might feel uncomfortable coming to us if something happened to them.
So
he got forced to take it down. I think
on his, wait, this is his personal Facebook?
Yeah, I think they have too tight a control on.
My goodness. So he posted his thoughts on his personal Facebook about the Kavanaugh situation.
I don't work for Crew anymore, and they complain that I post on my personal Facebook page because somehow I owe loyalty to a particular group.
That's stunning to me.
I thought it was unreasonable. I've talked to my dad, I've talked to others, and not everyone agrees. I think a lot of evangelicals, a lot of people I really care about, are imbalanced in the sense that they are overly compassionate. And I think this leads to issues with homosexuality too, where they're so worried about offending people that they over-listen. They're way too quick to accept whatever someone else says rather than thinking critically about it, which is not the biblical standards of justice, where you have to determine what happened, who was involved, etc. I mean,
right.
Think of the Mosaic laws back in Deuteronomy. Way you establish justice, 2 or 3 witnesses. But that's not the concern. It's listen to people and presume that they're in the right.
Now, you had told me about wanting to go talk. It was a group on campus. I don't know if it was the Young Republicans or more conservative group. And
oh yeah, I think, first of all, I'll say it was the same staff person who really didn't like conservative stuff. But that individual, I think, did learn not to interrupt a staff meeting and call someone out if they didn't like what was said, because that's what happened with my other coworker when he posted on Facebook. But this individual texted me and met up, and I had said in staff meeting, why don't we suggest that some of our young conservative guys maybe attend YAF or College Republicans or some other conservative group, Turning Point USA.
Young America's Foundation, for those who don't know.
Yeah. Because one of the things that we tried to do, because Crew's primarily evangelistic, is to get our students really involved on campus so they can meet non-Christians and so that they can make friends and do relational evangelism. It's not the only way to do it, but that's something that Crew promotes. And we were sending our students and suggesting they go to their engineering clubs, journalism club, whatever, for their major or some leadership thing. And I was looking at all the pamphlets, and you had these nice, cute-looking leadership events for UF, but I was thinking if I were a student, this would look boring as heck. So why not encourage our young males, who I know some of them are very conservative, go to College Republicans or YAF? And it seemed fine. It seemed like a reasonable thing to do at the time, but then I got a text and met up with the staff member, and she wanted to encourage me. I want to make sure that you know that YAF is a registered hate group.
Young America's Foundation, which I think their base is at the Reagan Ranch in California, that's a hate group.
And they promote white supremacists and racists, and I told her I'd never heard of this. I don't know anything. Thank you for telling me this. I asked her, who's got them registered? According to whom are they a hate group? And the response was the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I bit my tongue because I had about a month left. The SPLC is a hate group, and I wanted to say that. And again, her particular ideas are not reflective of Crew as a whole. I know that because we had a Faculty Commons conference, which was wonderful. It was fantastic. Faculty Commons is the faculty ministry for Crew, because we reach out not only to students but staff and the professors as well, and grad students. But they had a lawyer from the Alliance Defending Freedom come and speak about how you can and can't share your faith in the environment of a secular university. And the SPLC has labeled them a hate group too and got them demonetized from Amazon Smile. So clearly the SPLC standards are not the same.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So they'll allow a young Alliance Defending Freedom to come in, but if you were to go to a Young America's Foundation meeting, that's a double standard. It sounds like.
And that's, again, that's not reflective of the organization Cru, but
Right.
that's one individual within it. Again, I'm trying to explain my slice of the pie. And
Understood.
Cru didn't, my leaders didn't do anything to stop it. And I think that's part of the problem, is that you have a very vocal group. And I think that's why evangelicalism as a whole is going this way. You get very vocal, outspoken people who feel very passionately and promote these things, and other people, for the sake of peace, don't stop them.
It's just incredible to me that, I know this is a different event, but you're at this winter conference and they want you to go and, as a white male, go to Black students and invite them to a Black group, a Black ministry group. And that's in your purview as an intern with Cru. But then to encourage guys who are already conservative to go to a ideologically conservative group, with this, at least this one staff individual who had some authority, no, that's not okay. That's just blatantly contradictory in my mind, at least. It's just frustrating.
Her authority was limited, but still.
But it affected you.
It did. No one stopped that, and they didn't stick up for me when I think they really should have. But yeah,
So Scott,
I thought they didn't always care about, at least they didn't seem to care so much about white males or white students in general. One of the things I kept complaining about, because we had problem with shrinking numbers at our local movement at UF, and tried to point out a few times, especially the first year, I think we need to be careful about too much politics, because it's an evangelical organization. You got conservative people, especially among the young males. We don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot and destroy the numbers we actually have. But the big push was, let's get minorities, and that wasn't just my campus. That seemed to be the region as a whole, at least in Florida. I really can't imagine it wasn't elsewhere. And it was specific minorities. I remember two higher than my boss, the level higher than my boss at the local level. They came and met, and they wonderful guys. I like them. Had them over at my house, actually. Not here, but back in Florida. And I asked them, because they were talking about how we need to reach minority students. I asked them, what about Muslims or Jewish students? Because those are groups that need Christ. They don't have any knowledge of Christianity within their group, because it's a different religion. African Americans and Asians and Hispanics and white people in general all have Christians within their groups that can minister to them, or cross culture. But especially Muslims coming from a different country, there's a big need, and there's a growing number on our campus. That wasn't the priority. I asked them why it wasn't, and they said, well, I don't know. That's a good question. And it was very frustrating as a missions organization. Why not more of a push for that? Yeah,
Scott. Well, I'm grateful that you shared some of your experience, and it's concerning that this is happening, because this is where the rubber meets the road. It's one thing to hear what's going on at a big conference, but it's another thing to hear from the ground up, a student or an intern who's working with students, and to hear that these ideas are actually having an effect on campuses. And
in my experience, definitely.
Yeah. And so, I think the concerns that we would both share would be that, like you had just shared about the Muslims coming in, that there's a mission drift from sharing the gospel as the truth of God that applies to every person, and breaks down those gender and racial barriers and so forth, so people can unite. And we're building barriers, and then trying to I'm going to use the word privilege here, privilege some groups with the resources that Cru and other evangelical organizations have, while not putting emphasis where it's probably more needed. In the case of refugees coming here, that's just that's a concern over mission drift. I know there's more concerns than just that, but you kind of ended it on that note, and so that's what's percolating in my mind. What would you say are if you have other concerns, what would those be?
I think what you just described is a concern. I think a warped view of the covenant community, what it means to be a church. I think in my experience listening to some people, even here at Wheaton to some extent, less so because I haven't had as many conversations, but often the line between ethnic minority Christians and other Christians seems to be much darker, at least in the minds of the people promoting social justice, than the line between ethnic minority Christians and ethnic minority non-Christians.
That's fascinating. That's a good point.
And that's really concerning, because the New Testament call is to leave your father and mother and hold fast to Christ. You're a nation called out of the earth, a new people, to die to the old self, the old Adam, and put on the new. You can't do that. There is some overlap. I mean, we're in a inter-Advent period, but your ultimate identity is not with your family. In an earthly sense, your ultimate family is the church. And to see it any other way, and I don't think that people would outright disagree, although they might. I've been surprised. But that's functionally the way it seems to me.
Yeah. What advice do you have for those out there who are giving to Cru and they think, maybe my missionary that I support, they're doing good work? Would you have, maybe you haven't thought through this, but would you have advice for them on what they should do?
Yeah. I mean, I had a lot of ministries of partners, and I didn't promote these ideas. I wouldn't have, they couldn't have made me. In fact, there were times when I was talking alone with students where I explained, I think this is a bad idea. You should not go that way. So I would say, talk to your missionaries, talk to the Cru staff that you support. Definitely don't just pull funds, because it's really hard to raise money. It really is. I mean, I had to do it twice over the course of a summer, raise 40 grand. That's not easy. But if you're giving to the organization as a whole, maybe consider it, or a particular facet of it. Do your research first before you hurt people that aren't, because you don't want to chase out people from the ministry who aren't doing anything wrong, who are doing everything right. Try and minimize the collateral damage, but it might happen. People might not listen. And again, I really don't think that's my fault or your fault or anyone else pointing out these issues. That's the fault of the people who are actually divisive, those who are teaching false doctrine. That's the New Testament paradigm if you read the pastoral epistles.
Well, Scott, it was a pleasure getting your thoughts, and I appreciate you being brave enough to share them. And I'm sure you'll be getting some messages from friends and others probably about what you've said once this goes online. But, I commend you, and, stay in touch. All right.
All right. Thank you.
All right. God bless you.